Welcome to Classic Metal Class Session 28. You notice that we have not a newcomer here, but a new face who you're also going to see in a future session. So this is Rob Coulter, who is the chair of the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies out at University of Wyoming. And you might say, well, why did you bring on a chair of a department? Because he's also a metalhead like me and Scott. And he's actually, it's kind of a treat that we've got him here for this particular topic that I'll tell you about in just a sec. But next time, Rob is going to come on and give sort of a after report about a class that he's teaching, an academic class on philosophy and heavy metal. So totally within the scope of what we're doing here, and it'll be cool to find out, what worked, what didn't work. I think everybody probably knows my co-host Scott Tarulli, who is a working musician. Has been doing that for decades, playing with important bands, both in studio and out on tours. He's got his own albums that he's produced. He's been a band leader. He does a lot of innovative stuff, sort of outside of the usual box of rock or even jazz, doing some pretty cool things like that. And he's a professor of guitar at Berklee School of Music. And today, what we're going to be talking about is a topic that we examined way back in session one. It seems kind of vague. What makes best or greatest albums actually that? Is there a way to say that there are actually best or greatest albums that don't wind up just depending on record sales or popularity contests? And this turned out to be a very complicated topic. The last time that we looked at it, we used some really major iconic metal bands back then, Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, Motorhead, Dio, and Accept. This time we're gonna come back to the topic, and we're going to focus on a different scene. So the LA metal scene of the late 70s and early 80s, where we've got Van Halen, Quiet Riot, Rat, Motley Crue, and Wasp. Is it possible to say that one album for each of these bands is the best? That's an open question. And so I polled people on Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook and got some decent input. We're going to incorporate what those fans had to say. We're also going to look at what some of the band members themselves have to say. We're going to talk about what our learned and perfectly rational takes on these matters are. And we'll also look at what, fan polls have said and stuff like that. So, I mean, this is a really interesting scene. And I wanted to begin by just reading a little quote from Stephen Percy, the lead singer of Rat. He said that everything began in the LA scene with Van Halen's debut album. He said that people have to remember that after they released their album, there were only a handful of bands that really helped kickstart this whole LA music scene. There was Motley Crue, Quiet Riot, Wasp, and you had Rock's Regime, which turned into Stryper, Dante Fox, which became Great White, and then you had Rat. And everything was new back then. And for Rat, we concentrated on our live show. I'll put Rat up against any band back then because we'd kick their ass. Our live show was crazy, and that's what helped us sell 100,000 copies of our Rat EP. It was a crazy time. We might also think about Quiet Riot's 1983 Metal Health, first metal album to ever hit #1 on a Billboard 200 chart. You look at like the 1983 US festival that had Heavy Metal Sunday in a crowd of 500,000 people. They were there to hear some, big metal bands like Ozzy Osbourne, Judas Priest, the Scorpions, but it was also Van Halen, Quiet Riot, and Motley Crue. So 3 of the 5 bands that we're looking at were represented there. So I think we'll see what Scott and Rob think. This scene, if we pick these 5 bands to try to figure out this particular question, what are the best albums? Is there anybody we should have had in there that we didn't put in? I debated about Dokken, but I didn't get much feedback. But
Dokken, absolutely. I mean,
yeah.
I think Dokken is definitely a peer of all of them that you know, was through that whole time, and they were up there with those bands. It's weird. So you're basically you didn't get a lot of feedback for Dokken.
Yeah. And I thought, well, we did five bands originally. We'll do five bands now. Maybe six would be too much. But I don't know. I mean, are there any other like super important late 70s, early 80s LA bands that you think should have been in the mix?
Those are the big ones. You know, I think you've definitely got some of the like let's call them household names.
Okay. Yeah.
That would fit under that category. You know, like anybody watching this would probably recognize those bands.
It's interesting that you say household names because so household names in the 80s, definitely, right? As a matter of fact, some households wouldn't like that because they'd be like, you're listening to that terrible devil music. Which of them are still household names now? Definitely Van Halen,
Yeah.
definitely Motley Crue.
Yes.
I don't know that a lot of younger people would know who Wasp, who are still touring, Rat, who have broken up a while back, or even Quiet Riot. I don't know if they know about Quiet Riot, in part because it seems, and we'll talk about this more, like Quiet Riot peaked early, you know?
Well, there's a thing to remember them by. I think, like, take Great White. I think what kept
Yeah.
them in the news was the show I almost went to in Rhode Island,
Yeah.
where the place burned down. Um, I almost went to that show, but there's things like that that might keep them, maybe the younger generation knowing, but not by the music, I don't think.
Yeah. Eddie Van Halen dying a few years back and all the accolades about what a influential guitarist he was, maybe brought him back into the scene.
Mhm.
Yeah. I mean, Motley Crue is touring now, and they do remain pretty controversial. They kicked Mick Mars out of the group. There's debates about not only whether Vince Neil can actually sing, but whether Nikki Sixx is actually playing his bass or not.
Have
So,
you,
Yep.
have you seen those little clips people put together of Vince Neil, and that they like
oh,
supposedly transcribe it?
oh,
It's
jeez.
hilarious, right?
Oh
So
yeah.
it's like those bad lip reading videos or something like that, but it's actually got his voice as as recorded. It's like, you know, put out the cat, right? No, that's such hilarious stuff. Um,
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe he's forgotten what the actual lyrics are. Who knows? So let's talk about how we're going to approach this question. And this is a philosophical question. It's a question of value. Um, it's also, I think, a good musical exercise. And Scott, I'd be interested to hear what you think about, like, if this could be incorporated into musical curricula, getting young musicians to try to figure out not just what they're responding to, but why they think it's best. We have to, if we're going to take this seriously, there has to be some analysis, some argumentation, some criteria. And as I mentioned, we can't just go by album sales because that's not that helpful. And you don't want to just pull casual fans, because you're not going to get coherent explanations of why best albums are best. So what can we use as criteria? That's one question. And then another one that kind of fits in with this: whose views should we be taking into consideration? Should it be like music critics? Should it be the devoted fans? Should it be musicians themselves? Like, do the band members weighing in, should that sway us one way or another if we find out that, just to move it out of these bands, like let's say we ask Steve Harris of Iron Maiden, what's your favorite Iron Maiden album? And he's like, it's going to sound kind of funny, but it's actually Seventh Son of a Seventh Son. And we'd be like, really? That's of all the ones that you could have picked, that's the one. Well, I guess Steve Harris says so. So, I mean, what do you think about this idea of trusting the musicians?
Uh, I would always love to hear what they think, what they're most proud of,
Oh,
because
yeah, yeah.
as we've talked about in past episodes, there's different things that drive the next album. It could be a producer, it could be trends. And then, like we talked about Turbo, right? We talked about the Judas Priest album Turbo, where a lot of the new technology was used. you know, and 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 a lot of people were done with them when that album came out, but there's all kinds of things. But at the end of the day, what is the artist proud of? You know, it's like, well, we did this album because the record label said this, or so if Steve Harris said Seventh Son, there's a reason.
Yeah.
But I always do like hearing the artist. I like when people ask, well, what's your favorite personally, you know, for whatever reason. It could be like the one you'd pull out to listen to, or the one, if you had to erase your catalog, this is the one that exists. I mean, that's a tough question to ask somebody. But I think at the end that you are hearing the opinion of the artist, which is, I think, valuable, but doesn't have to sway your own. I think what I always explain is there's a list of criteria to evaluate music to the student. So there's some stuff like there's like headings and subheadings. So like we'll have something like phrasing. Okay, well, what does phrasing mean? Rhythms under there, kind of the sentiment of the, you know, some of it's the X factor, the sentiment of how it's delivered. And these are things that you could quantify. Was it in tune? No, it wasn't in tune, but do we discount it because it was out of tune?
Yeah.
You know, what if it's Iron Maiden in some pub in, you know, way early in the days, and they're all sweating and they're on fire, but, you know, the bass is slightly out of tune. Are you going to throw that whole performance out because the vibe was there? And that's kind of the X factor, where it's like, yeah, there's things that you could quantify, but you know, under the list, it's kind of like, here's what you could quantify. Is this a deal breaker? That's the next question. You know, like, well, maybe if you're in an orchestra, intonation is everything. Or if you're in the studio.
Yeah.
You know, I think now it's important because in music, we have a different definition of perfection. And that is, well, we're going to run this through something so everything's lined up perfectly and everything's dead in tune and everything's this, and then it's a perfect album. When we know that, you know, we love the first Iron Maiden EP, you know, or the Queensryche EP, and that was like, they had the studio for like 5 hours from 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. on a low budget, and it's fire, you know?
Yeah.
We're glad that they didn't take the characteristics out of that. So as far as the criteria, that's kind of what I guide my students. And then in response to, I would listen to anybody that could express intelligently what it is. It doesn't matter what they do. So if they're a sensitive layman, for example. And it's really this that got me in this. And I don't care if they're a musician or not. That's valid, but you can't just say it's wicked awesome, man. You know, I mean, there's a place for that, but you know, when I try to teach my students to articulate, I'm like, I know you like it, but let's find out what it is. If you, or if it's just the X factor, you don't know, it's that thing. So
well, you know, I think you hit on something really central, right? We don't want it to just be knee-jerk reactions like, that's so awesome, I love it, you know, or purely subjective. And one of the thinkers I was reminded of, I'd be curious to hear what Rob has to say about this. So Immanuel Kant, who we usually associate with like theoretical philosophy and practical philosophy, he actually has this whole book called The Critique of Judgment, and he's interested there in our aesthetic responses. And I think that these are essentially aesthetic responses, and he makes some really useful distinctions there. And he says that we can distinguish between, based on the way we respond and the objects of it, between like thinking about the good, which is morality. And Kant thinks that if we're making arguments, judgments about that, they have to be universal. They should convince everybody who's not just being perverse or, you know, sticking their head in the sand or something like that. And then at the other extreme, we have judgments about what's pleasant, you know, what we enjoy. So I've got this Guinness here, a non-alcoholic one, and I like the taste of Guinness, and some people do and some people don't. I remember one time I was actually drinking Guinness Extra Stout, and this guy from Liberia was in my dorm room. And he's like, "Oh, you drink that stuff?" And I was like, "Yeah, I love it, man." And he's like, "Oh, that's what we make people drink as an initiation right, because nobody likes it, you know?" So that's a great example of, some people like things and some people don't. And then in between, so here's like the real thing I think Kant has to contribute. Our aesthetic judgments are about, he calls it the beautiful, but I think it could be other things as well. So when we say, wow, that's really cool, and we actually have a reason why we think it's cool, it's interesting because it's not universal, but we treat it as if it is universal, which means that I try to provide arguments or justifications or a reason why you should be having the same response as me, even though you won't, most likely, right? So it's got this weird, not quite universality to it. And we know that we disagree about aesthetic matter. So if we're talking about bands and we're talking about like, this is the best album, this is Van Halen's best album, here's why. We know ahead of time that there's going to be controversy, but we still do try to provide arguments as if we were going to convince the other person. Kant thinks that's because there's something special about aesthetic arguments that lead us, even though we're not going to necessarily convince the other person, lead us to give reasons, justifications, ideas that could appeal to the other person. And every once in a while, it works, right? You let's say we're taking something easier than an album, which is a very complicated thing. You go to the art museum, there's a sculpture, somebody's like, "I don't get it, man, it's modern art." And you're like, "Well, look at these features of it. This is what I actually like about it. Here's what I respond to." And then they can be like, "Oh yeah, okay, I get it now. That is good art. I like that." Um, they have been they haven't been convinced by your reasons, but they've been led to see something for themselves. So I don't know what, Rob, you're a philosopher. What do you think about this,
Uh,
applying this to musical stuff?
oh, I think there's a lot to think about here, and I don't sort of have a particular view that's sort of cleanly articulated that I I endorse, but um, one of the things that comes up in these discussions, and I think one of the things that later thinkers in responding to Kant have brought up a lot, is that difference that we might have is very much a function of what background we bring to our
Right,
aesthetic
right.
experiences, right? And so, in thinking about metal, for example, right? I mean, there's just a bunch of obvious sorts of things, right? If somebody's come in listening to nothing but country music, there's a lot of things that um, you could imagine such person responding to metal music, depending on whether it's, Iron Maiden, or whether it's Rat, or whether it's Cannibal Corpse, or whatever, right? And they're going to bring a whole bunch of different responses to that.
Yeah.
Um, and but that one thing, Scott, that you were talking about with that X factor, right, is a lot of thinkers, that X factor, I guess, is maybe something akin to what some thinkers talk about as the sublime, right?
Right, right.
Right? That's something that is not just, I'm not able to articulate it, but it's something that's maybe not articulable at all,
Hmm.
right? And
Yes.
and so the truly purest of the aesthetic experiences we have will have an element of the sublime, and it's often described in these roundabout ways, like, when you first see, I don't know, the Mona Lisa, or when you first experience, um,
Hmm.
the Swiss Alps or something like that, you have this sort of awe response, right? and
I,
and
I think
So
with
maybe
some of
that's
the,
really important too. Even
yeah.
where we can articulate and reason about these things, this experience of the sublime is something that is essentially subjective in a way that our arguments and our discussions maybe aren't.
I kind of feel like with some of these bands, on some of their songs and albums, there is that aspect of it whether we heard it back in the 80s or we hear it again today. Like I think about Van Halen's Running with the Devil, right? When that bass comes in and then that first like guitar, almost like crinkling sound comes in.
Behind the nut, yeah.
You know, the hair on the back of your neck stands up. Even today, in 2024, listening to it more than what would it be? 35 years, 45 years after it was
Yeah.
out. Whereas maybe that's not the case with all of these bands. Like, I'm going to come straight out and say there isn't any Quiet Riot song that I hear that does that for me. They're fun, right? But I don't get that. There are some Rat songs that do that for me. But so yeah. Well, let's talk about criteria that we can use, right? So these are criteria that other people have often come up with, and we put aside extrinsic criteria like album sales and how many they stream. Why? Because that doesn't tell us much about value. That just tells us about popularity. And there seem to be some other criteria that are more accidental than essential. Like, somebody might say, well, this is the best album because it's the first one that I listened to. That's interesting historically, but that doesn't tell you why it's the best album. I mean, the first Iron Maiden album I listened to was Peace of Mind. And it's a great album. I wouldn't say it's the best album. And it certainly isn't the best because I listened to it. How's that going to convince anybody else, right? And we could also say, well, maybe we look at which albums were the most influential on other bands. That could be a criterion. We could also look at, what's in the set lists from these albums, what songs go into the best of or live albums, sort of the core of the performative catalog. Now, if we do that, like with Rat, it's clear that Out of the Cellar is, there's the most songs in the playlist are from Out of the Cellar, and that tends to be what fans seem to respond to the most. And we can say that, I think, with Quiet Riot as well with Mental Health, right? So that, maybe there's something to that. Scott had last time the killer to filler ratio criterion. Maybe that's more on point. Do you skip any songs in the album? If you do, then maybe it's not the best album. And this is kind of important because an album, even if it's not a concept album, an album is a unity, right? It portrays the band, what it's offering at a certain point in time. Scott, you mentioned Turbo. A lot of people were like, what the hell is this? I don't want this. And then other people were like, no, this is actually really cool. And I think people's perceptions of that album has changed over time. We might also think about an album as being great because it represents a band at their pinnacle, at their best. So, maybe we focus on like the classic lineup of the band playing together, turned up to 11. So, a good example of a problem this would pose is, Motley Crue did an album with John Corabi singing he was arguably better than Vince Neil at that time, just called Motley Crue. And it's very controversial, is that some people actually think that's the best Motley Crue album. It's a hard case to make, but should it be up there in the ranks? Some people might say, well, it's not really Motley Crue, is it? It's Motley Crue with John Corabi. So these are all important criteria. And when we're looking at what they say on websites, I think it's kind of interesting. I'd be curious to see what you two make of this as well. So they'll usually have lists, and the list will have a top album, right? And they'll usually give a justification. This one's it rocks the hardest or something like that. But then they'll have a list of the other ones. And what we see from that is like, who are the runners up in this poll or this reviewer's mind? I think it's kind of interesting to look at who is second or third. Now, that's not determining who's the best, but I don't know. Do you think we get anything out of looking at who else is in the contention, or is it more important just to try to determine which is the best using whatever criteria we have? What would you say?
Want to go ahead, Rob?
Sure. Gosh, I mean, there's so many. One of the things that I think with aesthetic judgments and is there's so many different axes that are relevant,
Hmm.
right? So I think it ends up looking something like, I don't know, a 20th dimensional space, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, right. And all these things are relevant, right? And um, influence certainly is big. The killer to filler ratio, I think, is big. And you mentioned, Greg, the idea of an album being a unity, but I mean, not all albums are unities, right? Right.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Some of them like aspire to be, but fail. Some of them don't aspire to be at all, right? I mean, like a lot of best of compilations or something like that might not have that kind of unity that the albums that they pick from do.
Right.
But
Yeah.
um, there are sort of agenda setting albums, right? That sort of set the agenda for a band moving forward that we might take to be, I mean, the importance of an album might be different from whether an album is their best album, right? And so I'm
Yeah.
always, whenever I get into discussions with somebody about, you know, who's the best band of this kind or what's the best album by this band, I'm like, what axis are we talking about? And or what subset of those axes? And I think, I don't think that, I'm inclined to say, let me put it this way, I could be convinced otherwise, but I'm inclined to say that there is no answer to what the best album is, probably for any band, right? There's the best album on these particular questions, or the most important on these other particular questions, or whatever
Right.
you want
Yeah.
to say
Yeah.
about that. But I think just like ranking albums, boom, 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 is I mean, I just don't think it can be done in any defensible way in the end, right? I mean, I suppose there could be some exceptions, right? A band has 3 albums and 2 of them are just hot garbage, uh, right? But
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
for the bands we're talking about, I think certainly Van Halen or something like that, right? What do you mean, right?
I think, if there is one band where it's probably going to be easiest to say this is clearly the best, it's going to be Quiet Riot. And it's not as if the other albums are hot garbage, but I think I'm not alone in thinking that nothing measures up to Mental Health. It's like they peaked, but I don't want to say peaked in high school because obviously they were older than that, but somehow things just didn't work as well after that. And it could be, succeeding too much too early, sort of thing. I mean, how do you follow that up? They tried to follow it up with Condition Critical, which was some people think is their second best album, but it's still second best in most people's views. But yeah, when it comes to Van Halen, oh, that's very tough. Or Rat or Wasp,
Yeah. Uh, as far as the lists go, I tend to ignore them. Like
Okay.
I actually don't usually get controversial at all, but I did post, there was a best guitarist list.
Oh, are you talking about the one where Taylor Swift was included?
Yep. I didn't say anything about Taylor Swift. I didn't say anything about anybody, but I just kind of made the point that this is used to be controversial to sell ad space.
Yeah.
Who picked them? There was no reason why. And I noticed that they just put it out there and everybody was talking about it and sharing it.
Right.
And
Right.
so
Yeah.
the criteria there is, getting people to get angry, to like motivate them to be angry, and then talk about it. And then there's this clickbait.
Yeah.
So it was kind of the example that I use. It's kind of like, it's like they put random people on the list. There was no, because in the Rolling Stone every year, where do they get greatest guitarists of all time? And there's no criteria for it. It's just, I mean, it's just clickbait, so like I haven't seen a list by any publication that gave any criteria rather than maybe, well, because they're popular, or we're not going to give you a reason, we're just going to put it there and you can fight about it. But so I guess I haven't seen a publication put a greatest album list or anything up that I would pay attention to.
I think there's some on like reliable, let's call them rock/metal sites that provide like justifications
Oh, okay, yeah.
for it that are helpful, at least in guiding our thinking about it. So let's jump in. Let's look at our first band. So Van Halen, why pick them? Well, they're at the origin of all this. And I didn't want to have us like try to do both the original Van Halen with David Lee Roth and the Van Hagar era with Sammy Hagar, because it's kind of like apples and oranges. I think the band really changes in a significant way. But also when we look at lists, the Van Hagar albums don't make it in generally, except for 5150. So, they are the LA band that makes it big first. And some people even talk about them as revitalizing heavy metal. They open the door to the other LA bands. And they're also the band we got the most feedback about. So the main contenders in most people's views seem to be Van Halen 1, which makes perfect sense, Fair Warning, and surprisingly, 1984. I remember an era when 1984 was looked at as like a weak point. I mean, we loved it at the time, and it's got some great tracks on it, but I think it's sort of like Turbo. It got a lot of hate. So, articles that were giving fan or expert assessments, Ultimate Classic Rock said the debut album, and then number 2 was 1984, and number 3 was Fair Warning. Louder Sound, again, the debut album, but then they said, again, 1984. And then they said Van Halen 2, which is kind of a surprising choice for me.
Yeah.
Guitar World did a poll, and they came up with the debut album, then Fair Warning, and then 5150, which was a little surprising, but then 1984 right away. And the band members themselves, Eddie Van Halen, who was asked to name his 6 favorite albums of all time, included the Van Halen debut as number 5. So that's kind of a big endorsement, I would say. David Lee Roth was asked which one of his albums was the favorite. He actually said the first one because they'd played for years in the clubs and the bars. And so you really sharpen your music without thinking. And then when you go to the studio, it's like totally familiar to you. Michael Anthony said that Fair Warning was his favorite from the David Lee Roth album. And Wolfgang Van Halen, now he's not a member of the band originally, but I think he's worth thinking about. He actually says that his favorite is Fair Warning. And now he's got an interesting criterion. He says it was an album where my dad just said, screw it, and did what he wanted. I think that's why it's a cult classic. It was never a huge album compared to the others. And then, the people that responded in social media, it was all over the map. One person said, I like Women and Children First the most. It's whimsical and dark and heavy in places, seems more creative and fun. Somebody else said, Van Halen 1 and 1984 are the contenders. I prefer 1984 because it has the hits. That being said, Van Halen 1 is a better album. And has better album cuts and better flow. Somebody else was for 1984. They said it's a clean run of great tracks, whereas the debut has the Kinks cover and Ice Cream Man, which they didn't like. And then we got somebody else plugging for Fair Warning. And I like this. Fair Warning is the best of the Dave era. It's gritty, dirty, less of the party vibe, and Ed's riffs and tone are god tier on that record. Nothing in their catalog grooves like Mean Street. The entire album is a vibe. It's unique among the original 6-pack. So you get a lot of different perspectives. What do you guys think? I mean, would you restrict, like, let's say you had to pick the top 3, would it be debut 1984, Fair Warning, or you think maybe 1984 doesn't belong in there? Um, I mean, I'm inclined to actually go along with that myself on retrospect. If you'd asked me 20 years ago, I don't know if I would have picked those three myself. What do you think?
I love Diver Down,
Okay.
Hmm.
right? And then that hasn't come up at all.
Well,
I
that one actually got a lot of it got put at the bottom of a lot of lists. And the
yeah.
reason was too many cover songs, right? But it's kind of a weird complaint to make about a band that had a catalog of over 100 songs they played in the clubs. A lot of the things on Diver Down were things they had played years and years back. So yeah,
I think there's some really cool bits where Eddie's playing around with some stuff. You know, Little Guitars is a cool song,
oh
man.
yeah.
Yeah.
Some stuff like that. So I might be inclined to put that ahead of 1984.
Would
The
would
others are
you
great.
would you put Diver Down as number one?
No, I don't think I would,
Okay.
but in the top three, I yeah.
What do you think, Scott?
Uh, so Van Halen wanted Fair Warning, but I want to say something you kind of touched on, which is fascinating. When 1984 came out, it was a bit of a disappointment to us all, I think. Um, you know, the keyboard heavy and,
Right, right.
part of it. But most of the people at Berkeley, the young generation, that's their favorite album, they say. And
Oh,
I'm kind of curious because they weren't alive at that time, right?
yeah.
you know, I'm always like, you into Van Halen? Yeah. Like, do you have an album you like? 1984 is consistently like the one they name, unless it's the only one they know. But I'm always shocked because I remember at the time, 1984 coming out, going, okay, like, you
Yeah.
know, I mean, Al Wade had a beautiful guitar solo in it, and you know, uh, Panama was a great tune, and there's some great tunes on there, but next to Fair Warning,
Yeah.
I didn't, so I agree with you. Like at the time, so it's weird to see now. Now we're at an age where we saw something come out, we remember the general response to it, and then seeing it generations past, looking back, going, "That's the one."
Yeah.
And I wonder why. But 84 wouldn't be on the list for me. Um,
It's interesting when I think about 1984 and the songs that I like the best on it, it's changed over time. And
hmm,
I would say the two that I think are the best songs on it are Girl Gone Bad and House of Pain. And House of Pain is one that they played back in the clubs years and years before it was recorded. And I think both of those songs could have been on Fair Warning, frankly.
okay.
Um,
Yeah.
and I think that's part of what attracts me to that. I if I have to pick like what's the best Van Halen record, I say Fair Warning, even though I really do like the debut. And it's for some of those reasons. It's dark, it's groovy, it feels almost like the band is totally coming to their own on it. And that I know not everybody's attracted to it for that reason. Um, but that's what does it for me. So if the two of you, if I put you on the spot, what is the best, and why do you think it's the best?
For me, it's the debut.
Okay.
Um, but not by a long shot, right?
Yeah.
Um, and I guess I think for me it was like seeing that kind of guitar playing with the you know wild fun vocals that David Lee Roth brought was just kind of totally new, right? And
Yeah.
and and that was great. One thing. So I'd have to put that as number one. One thing about 1984 though is that was the first real MTV record by them, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
When Jump came out and we got to see all their faces, and their personalities, and Eddie's going back and forth between the guitar and the keyboard, and we got David Lee Roth tight pants everywhere, the Hot for Teacher video, every teenage boy in the world was watching it over and over and over again. So it made a mark in a different way than the others did. So that's my thought about 1984. But yeah, if I had to pick one, it's the debut.
Yeah, it's close between the debut and Fair Warning. I will say about the debut is, I mean, we come from the vinyl era, and that's when, as you turned it up louder, it got fatter and warmer. Right.
Yeah.
Well, MP3s, which you'll just kill your hearing if you turn it up. And it's such a live album. Like it's such it just sound, I mean, they basically tracked it. They did multiple things, but like they were such a tight band, and they just played so well together time-wise. And the thing about Eddie Van Halen that people miss is his rhythm playing is untouchable. And like on any of the stuff, it's just kind of like his rhythm playing and his solos are the same thing to me, because his time is consistently fire. And it's just kind of like the band is a working machine. Now, Fair Warning, I do think that was like, I felt like that's the one that like I pull out the most and that I get most amped up. I have them all on vinyl still, right? And you asked something earlier. I actually think it's fascinating that we got the information from Wolfgang that he knew his father was just like, screw it, I'm just really gonna. And it's like, you know what? I can hear that, but like I would have said that for the first album too, but maybe there's something about Fair Warning that I didn't realize. Maybe I'm hearing that Eddie just going, forget it, I'm just gonna go for it. And but like, all those early albums sound very live to me. And, and it's something you could crank in your living room, and you're experiencing the band in your living room, or you're experiencing, I mean, the songs are great, but for it to like, Mean Street, just that riff at the beginning, Eddie could just play that riff at the beginning, and like his time and groove is so good. It's just like, wow, I'm sold. And then when the band comes in, it's like, oh my God, it's just, I mean, so mine's gonna be Fair Warning.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. Well, let's move on to the next big LA band, one that had missteps before they actually clicked, and that's Quiet Riot. First two albums with Randy Rhoads are only released in Japan, which means as far as LA, fans are concerned, it may as well be on the moon. The album isn't available. And so they're playing, they actually break up when Randy Rhoads leaves, and then they reform. And then they wind up coming out with Metal Health. And so that's one of the big contenders. Maybe Condition Critical or Quiet Riot 3 could be placed up against it. Interestingly, there weren't any best album articles out there in the music magazine sites. There are some fan rankings, but they're all pretty just, what do you think? There's no like justification for it. There was a ranker poll, and as far as like sites about music, I can't take ranker particularly serious because anybody can get on there. But predictably enough, Metal Health they thought was the best, and then Condition Critical, then Quiet Riot 3. So they're basically just following the chronology and saying it's going down. I did get a little bit of feedback in social media. One person said mine would be Metal Health for nostalgic reasons rather than technical reasons. So that's probably not a good justification. Somebody else wrote, I have Quiet Riot 3. I bought it back in grade school, original vinyl. That tells us nothing. Right?
Yeah, that just says own it.
Yeah, that's actually a good friend of mine who wrote that in there. But he didn't follow up and give us any criteria.
Maybe that was the point. Like, like the unimpressed emoji.
Oh,
Have the
yeah,
album.
there you
Hey,
go.
that album you did, I heard it.
Yeah. Now, Rudy Sarzo, and so if there's anybody who we want to like ask, it would be Rudy Sarzo and Carlos Cavazo, because
Mhm.
unfortunately, a lot of the original members are dead. So Rudy Sarzo was asked, in what ways do you think metal health influenced the landscape of heavy metal music? And he said, yeah, it did, but every other band had to bring their best and everybody else did. Motley Crue was wonderful. There's still all these guys, Rat, Doc, and they were ready. We were all ready. We just happened to have, in my opinion, and according to facts, the reason why Quiet Riot went into the studios to cut some demos that became Metal Health was because the producer and owner of the label was looking for a singer who could sing Come On, Feel the Noise. That was it. That's all he wanted. And if this guy can sing the song, he put it on a record, it's going to be a hit. So he chose Kevin Dubrow, as his vision for that. That was the difference between us and everyone else. Plus, we had Randy to guide us early on because it was Quiet Riot. So he's basically, he's not answering, is this the best album? He's just saying, this is where everything came together and all that. And then Carlos Cavazo was asked, why did Quiet Riot falter after Metal Health? And he says, well, that was the high point. And it was a lot of pressure to keep up with Metal Health. I don't think this was the band's fault. The producers and record label always tried to push us in certain directions that didn't make sense. For example, Quiet Riot 3 had many songs that weren't metal at all. We should have stuck to our guns and stayed true to what we were about. If we had, we could have come up with way better songs than what ended up on that album. And it wasn't for lack of trying. We'd submit songs and they'd say, no, we don't like these. Go back to the drawing board and write some more. They're always trying to push us into a more radio friendly space. And that was never the type of band Quiet Riot was. So maybe that explains why a Metal Health. I mean, let's start with this. Do both of you think Metal Health, arguably the best album Quiet Riot does produce, or is there one where you're like, no, I think people are mistaken. This is actually a better album. What do you think?
No, I think um, Metal Health is the only Quiet Riot album I've listened to more than once.
Oh wow.
Okay. So, um, so yeah, I
Now
would say so, and I don't think it's close.
let's follow up on that. Was it because you listened to the album and you're like, nope, not any good. I'm never listening to this again, or just lack of interest, or
More lack of interest, right? I mean,
okay.
and of all these bands, um, and one of the things that some of those comments from Sarzo and Cavazo that you mentioned is for me, even on Metal Health, it never felt like this was a band that knew what they were and knew what they
Okay.
wanted to do, and probably some of that is because of here's a label trying to tell them, right, MTV friendly, radio friendly. We're going to
Yeah.
capitalize on this thing like Van Halen's doing. And here's some other guys like Van Halen, and they're sort of imposing this thing on them. Mate, I suspect that's part of it, but I also suspect that they didn't know what they were doing well enough to
Yeah,
steer
yeah.
that effectively. So Quiet Riot is, so Metal Health is the only album to me that comes together really as an album at all. And I mean, it's maybe
Yeah.
not the most charitable reading of it all, but that's
So
Well,
it's sort of the best by default then.
yeah, 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 in my opinion.
so my take on it is, unlike Van Halen, Quiet Riot's music didn't stand the test of time.
Yeah.
I think Metal Health was amazing for the time. I mean, I remember playing air guitar, and it was, the 80s was very pivotal. All the movies and all the art, pop culture art, had to do with the teenagers versus the evil, oppressive parents. You had the
Yeah.
Breakfast Club, you had
Right,
like
right.
those movies where it was like against authority. And it was a fun rock and roll album against authority. And it was great for the times. Now, with that said, yeah, Metal Health although I don't think it stood the test of time, I think even during the times going through, like hearing each of the albums, I thought Condition Critical was cool, you know. But like that one was the one that, it really made an impact in my memory. Like I remember actually when that song came on the radio, getting like pretty psyched up, you know. Um, and would I go back and listen to that album? Probably not, you know. I probably wouldn't choose to listen to it again like I would Fair Warning.
Yeah, yeah.
So I just think Quiet Riot's one of those. Yeah, I have to judge it differently because I don't think they stood the test of time. So I'm going to have to go to my younger reaction when I was a kid as they came out, you know?
Yeah.
And it did make an impact at the time. I mean, there's a word for that when movies or whatever use something that's topical, like a phrase or something. My brother,
Zeitgeist, perhaps?
what is it?
Zeitgeist?
Maybe.
Capturing the spirit of the age. Yeah.
Yeah.
I like that. Maybe that's what it is. So like, like things in movies when they're like for shizzle, it's like they're using like, they're like using the common thing that's not going to stand the test of time. It's going to be,
Yeah.
but it's kind of a disposable thing. But for the time is a great album. I definitely give it credit, and it's fascinating to see that for the third album could have been their greatest, but
Yeah.
it's they weren't. And from Rudy, he's obviously saying it's not for lack of trying, because that's what I said earlier is they could have to do with the record label or the trends. It's like, hey, the kids are liking this now, you have to do this,
I kind of think going back to something that you guys were talking about earlier, I don't want to use the word leadership, but there's something about like the people who are the band members being in charge, structuring things that Van Halen had. I mean, if Van Halen had a problem, it was that there were too many leaders. And David Lee Roth and Eddie Van Halen, sooner or later, one of them was going to have to go. But Michael Anthony is also just absolutely central with his adding the high harmonies, the way he plays bass and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And with Quiet Riot, I mean, losing Randy Rhoads to Ozzy, who poached him essentially. Kevin Dubrow's the front man and the leader, but he's kind of a screw up, He's bitter, he denigrates the other LA bands, and it backfires. He and Rudy Sarzo can't really get along that well. It looks like Frankie Banali and Carlos Cavazo are nice guys, but neither one of them is exercising a lot of like authority over what's going on. So you could see these guys getting pushed around by the record label much more easily than say Van Halen would, where they'd be like, "Hey, we know what we're doing. Screw you. We're doing this," So yeah, and it leads to sort of a lack of direction. Each of those early Van Halen albums, it's clearly something different than the last album, but recognizably so. And, there's some dips. Okay, so Van Halen 1, the debut, is amazing. Van Halen 2 is good, but not maybe great. But then each album, there's like another, it's turning the band in a different direction. I think with Quiet Riot, Condition Critical, it's good, it's not great. And then you could be like, okay, maybe their third album will be the one. But then they come out with this weird mishmash. And then every album after that, the band has changed its composition. They don't seem to have a real direction anymore. I mean, nowadays, Rudy Sarzo is essentially the band leader because he's just been around. And I think they're fun in concert, but that's about all you can say,
Yeah. But I do follow, there's, Rudy Sarzo is a legend, he's just, and he's
played with Ozzy, played with Whitesnake, yeah.
Yeah. So, and he's still thriving. I mean, he looks healthy. He takes care of himself. He's kind of a good, he's one of the good ones these days. Like I follow him on Instagram and it's kind of cool to see him and everything. So, but yeah, like it's cool to hear him because he's also a bright guy. I mean, they bring him into interviews a lot, and I always like when they have him because he's got real insight as opposed to like Kevin DeBrow, who's just a trash talker. Every magazine that I would read back in the day, he was just I just remember him as a trash talker. You know, it's just kind of
Yeah.
like, and that was off-putting even as me as a teenager. It wasn't like, yeah, I was like, wow, you know, like you're not the best though. You're not, you know.
I
Well,
mean,
he
it's
never seemed like a guy you wanted to hang out with to me.
that's a
That's a
good way
good
to put
point.
it. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's sort of like Michael Schenkner, you know,
Mm.
when you read him running down his brother, Rudolf Schenkner, who clearly is not the great soloist that Michael is, but he's certainly a better band leader. I mean, as a composer, Rudolf Schenkner knows exactly what he's good at. He knows who to bring in at what places. You read this stuff and you're like, what's wrong with you? Why, we love you as a guitarist. We love you as a band leader. Why do you have to talk all this crap, Um, you don't want to just say, shut up and play, a la the Dixie Chicks or something, but you almost get close to that,
Yeah, that's a tough one. Yeah, the Schenker brothers don't get along, right? At all, I don't think.
Clearly not. Yeah.
Um, but it's interesting to hear that, well, not to get off topic, the Scorpions albums with Schenker, with Michael. I love, well, of course, you know, we always talk about Worldwide Live being the benchmark of like live albums at the time. But what's his name? Matthias Jabs, he was fantastic, but I think he fit the band better. Exactly what you're saying. He was able to leave space for
Oh,
the
yeah.
you know, to lead the band and everything. And that's important. You know, that's really important that rather than Van Halen having too many people in charge, maybe, or
Yeah.
everybody having the say or the ego. A band can't really exist with that. So
Yeah. Well, we move on now to a band where that was clearly a problem, Motley Crue. So when you look at what people say is their best album, Shout at the Devil's a big one in there. Dr. Feelgood, I'd say it's about half and half in terms of what people tend to say. And then the other ones that tend to get a lot of love are Too Fast for Love, the first album, and interestingly, the Motley Crue that was done with John Corabi. There's quite a few people who really like that one. So on music sites, Ultimate Classic Rock said Shout at the Devil, followed by Too Fast for Love, and then Dr. Feelgood. Consequence said Too Fast for Love, Dr. Feelgood, and then Shout at the Devil. So you're starting to see a theme there. Too Loud, Too Old Music, Shout at the Devil, Motley Crue 1994, and Too Fast for Love. Vince Neil includes Girls, Girls, Girls in his list of favorite albums of all time. So that seems kind of interesting.
yeah,
Louder Sound interviewed Nikki Sixx, and they asked him, Dr. Feelgood is the band's biggest seller, but do you think it's your best album? And he says, I think there's some shining moments. I think all of our albums have some of those. Every album has the songs like Kickstart My Heart, Shout at the Devil, Live Wire, or Wild Side. But their albums, even with my favorite band, it's about the whole package. I don't listen to singles. So he gives kind of an evasive answer. Mick Mars actually thinks the Karabi album is his favorite. He
hmm.
said that it's like taking a step backward to me to the Motley Crue John Corabi album, which was in my opinion, the best Motley Crue album. A lot of people didn't like it, but I thought it's really good. And then Tommy Lee was asked about it, and they said Mick Mars said it was a really great album. And Mick Mars says, I listen to the album and go, my God, it's one of my favorite albums too. I'm with Mick on that one. What
Hmm.
a great record. What a great, great record. Later on, he says, it's huge. It's one of my favorite Crue records. Sonically, the songs and playing on that record is gnarly. We worked our butts off on that record. We had so much to prove. Vince was gone. We had a new singer who also plays guitar and writes, and he brought a whole new element to this. But once fans are used to a different thing, they didn't want to know about any other version of Motley Crue. That's understandable. But when you break it down, the record still sounds rad today. I think that's pretty interesting. There's a lot to unpack there. In social media, people were saying Dr. Feelgood still sounds incredible today, and they gave a good reason for it. The mixing on the low end is next level good. that's, that's an important factor, how the album actually sounds. Another person said Dr. Feelgood, the production is incredible. Songwriting is tighter and way more consistent. Earlier Motley Crue albums had too many B-sides or tossed off tunes. I suspect Drinking Drugs took way more time than stupid songwriting. This is the album that it all clicked on. And then somebody else said it's hard ranking anything other than Dr. Feelgood as number one. However, Generation Swine is very underrated. Now that's interesting because in all the like listings, Generation Swine ends up almost at the bottom. Uh, either that or with New Tattoo, or the other one that was huge when we were kids, and there's not a lot of love for it today, Theater of Pain. That one is at the very bottom of some of these listings, which is interesting because I'll just say for me, and I know Scott had a similar experience. First Motley Crue album, Too Fast for Love, Shout at the Devil. We're like, we know exactly what this band is. They're heavy metal. They're really cool. Look at these outfits and stuff like that. Then Theater of Pain comes out, and you're like, and you're reading about them in like Circus Magazine and Hit Parader, and you're like, these guys really changed their look. They're weird. What's going on here? And then you listen to the album, and you're like, who took all the heaviness and hardness out of this? What's going on here? But it was the album that was huge for like reaching a much wider audience.
Right.
And so I felt like a weirdo complaining about it because everyone else is like, this is really awesome. And I was like, I don't think it's awesome,
Oh yeah. Well, Theater of Pain, it's interesting because I think it turns out that was their sober album.
Oh,
I know, but
so in a way, Motley Crue does better work when they're high and drunk, you're saying.
well, that and because they were sober, they weren't getting along. So like people weren't showing up to sessions, people show up late, it's getting sober, a lot of times you will lose your friends, right?
Yeah.
So I wonder if that had something to do with it. But I agree, Theater of Pain was horrific. I mean, like when it came out, I was like, Home Sweet Home. I was like, who is this?
Yeah.
I was so disappointed. I'm like, but we all know that it was like trying to reach a bigger audience. I mean, right when I was like, okay, now my friends that hate Motley Crue like Motley Crue.
Yeah, yeah.
No, that was their MTV album.
Right? That's right. You're right.
That was their MTV album. They smoking in the boys' room.
Right. Yeah.
So they got a little story video and blah blah blah. Right. I mean, yeah.
So
yeah.
what would you guys pick as the best Motley Crue album, and why would you pick that one? Would it be Dr. Feelgood?
Now, for me, it would probably be Shout at the Devil.
Okay.
Although I would put Dr. Feelgood in a close second, I think, because that was when, for me, that was when it started to feel like more like the old stuff again, right? Right. It sort of brought back the heaviness and the edge that they had in the first two albums. But Shout of the Devil for me is the first one. First one for me. Yeah.
What about you, Scott?
I do agree with a lot of people that Dr. Feelgood is a well-produced album. I like the songs on Shout at the Devil and the riffs on Shout at the Devil. That guitar riff to Too Young to Fall in Love is so cool. And like, that was actually my favorite song for the album at the time. I would like lift the needle up and put it back. I just wanted to hear that riff. It was, and of course the video was beyond ridiculous. Them just punching ninjas in the face and like, and the ninjas like falling but I would say Shout at the Devil. I think it's the most, I get the most emotionally charged out of hearing that because of the riffs. Dr. Feelgood's a great record. Like I definitely get that, but I mean, I think some of the tunes on there, they have a few things that like are approaching what's the one I never liked like Same Old Situation was one of them that was kind of like going towards um oh God, why am I forgetting?
I mean,
And
it's kind of Aerosmithy, really. You
it's kind
know?
of Aerosmithy.
A
Well,
little bit. I always heard a little bit of Poison in
that's what I was just gonna say.
Oh, okay, yeah, yeah,
It was
yeah.
more towards the Poison side. If it's Aerosmith, it's the Dion Warren, Diane Warren stuff that she wrote for them. But Same Old
Okay.
Situation. Some of that I'm like, now they're kind of crossing over with Poison, and no disrespect to Poison, I think they have their place, but um, that to me was good, but not totally a Motley Crue album to me.
it.
Yeah. I mean, I would agree. I think that Shout at the Devil is the best album. Production is better on later albums, but you kind of expect that. Not only just because the band is getting more experienced and they can hire better people, but the standards are going up, right? In the across the 80s, but it's still an album that holds up over time. And some of the other ones don't so much, you know?
Yeah, I do want to say that because earlier I had mentioned the benchmark for what people call perfect, which I don't agree with their definition of perfect.
Yeah.
Um, Now, like in the 80s, there was a lot of short budget bands. Like that White Line album, Pride, sounds like it was recorded in a garbage can, right? But the songs are so good on
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
And you could tell it was one of those, here's $3,000. You have from 1 a.m. to 7 a.m. to record.
Yeah.
And like you hear like a few blatant mistakes, but you're like, wow, this is fire. They're young and hungry. That young hunger thing. We always talk about the opening act having an opportunity
Yeah,
to
yeah.
sell themselves to 20,000 people and them being fired up. And you hear it in even the budget recordings. And that's kind of the exciting part that gets me to listen to it again. I would never use the thing overproduced because sometimes very, very heavily produced albums are beautiful. Like Peter Gabriel's stuff is stunning. But
Yeah.
but I just think for this, the part of it too is I think the fact that it's well done. Um, the Motley Crue, the early Motley Crue albums, but there's something about that. I think that was their album that brought them to the top, right? As far as like
Shout at the Devil. Yeah.
they started
Yeah.
headlining, and it's kind of like you could kind of hear it in the plane, and that's that's what I say. It's like I tell everybody, it's kind of the you don't want to miss the intrinsic value of a performance, even if it's like on an album. Because back then they had 2-inch tape, there was no digital, there was no fixing. If you screwed up, you had to punch it in and play it correctly.
Right, right.
So there was, and there was no auto tune, and there's nothing wrong with that because, there's still perfect albums to me that like might have fret buzz or might have a little pitchiness here, or the guitar kind of goes a little sharp. Those aren't deal breakers. It's the sentiment. Yeah, I just kind of think that while we're talking about these early albums, the way that they were made turns out to be really pretty awesome.
That's an interesting thing. The ethos of the band Motley Crue changes over time, right? So those first early albums, you could look at them, you could listen to it, you could be like, wow, these guys are badasses, now they love to like drink and screw and, they're probably doing every drug that's available, but they also seem like tough guys, right? And then Theater of Pain comes out and you're like, whoa, what happened here? And then even with Girls, 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 Dr. Feelgood, they never get it back completely. It's still about hedonism and stuff like that, but you're like, yeah, they're still kind of glam more than like what we nowadays call traditional heavy metal.
Hmm.
I
Yeah.
almost feel like on Shout at the Devil, they could have taken it two different ways from there, right? And the way they went was that glam MTV friendly thing, but I almost felt they were also sort of on the cusp of going more extreme.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. So they had the riffs were heavy and fast and all of that, but for whatever reason,
they could have been considered speed metal, right?
Yeah. They could have been there, and they could have taken it off in that direction, and they didn't for whatever reason. probably had something to do with money and girls, right?
Yeah.
But but yeah, I mean, once they sort of did Theater of Pain and stuff, their trajectory was set.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're
I
right
mean,
about that. I
at
didn't think
least
about that.
at least what we can say is they weren't Quiet Riot peaking with the first early albums. They were able to come back and do some interesting stuff, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Leading in then to another band that a more consistent discography, we could say, Rat. When people are asked about that, Out of the Cellar, not a surprise. A lot of people say that's their best, but interestingly, a lot of people also think their second one, Invasion of Your Privacy, is actually better than Out of the Cellar. And I think there's a case that could be made. And then there's two other that keep coming up, Detonator and Infestation. And Infestation is 2010. It's got a different band to it. Robin Crosby's been replaced by Carlos Cavazo, who I think may be a better player than Crosby ever was. And Detonator's 1990, which is kind of an interesting feature too. So the music sites, Metal Kingdom actually says Detonator's the best one, and Out of the Cellar is second best. Too Loud, Too Old also holds out for Detonator and then Out of the Cellar. VW Music had a weird kind of ranking where and I actually want to read some of the justifications. So they said Detonator, Invasion of Your Privacy, Reach for the Sky, Dancing Undercover, Out of the Cellar is number 5 in their listing. And then Rat, the self-titled one from 99, and then Infestation. And their justification, which I don't agree with, is Out of the Cellar is a great debut, but lacks deep cuts compared to the remaining albums on this list. Sure, the singles on this album, like Round and Round, Wanted Man, Lack of Communication, are all good. Even songs like Back for More, Wanted Man, and In Your Direction are fun, but the rest of Out of the Cellar isn't very memorable, in my opinion. Although it's an excellent debut, I don't think they're clicking on all cylinders. And then their justification for making Detonator number 1. I love the bluesy influence in the intro to Shame, Shame, Shame. Will tell you all you need to know about where Warren DeMartini is here. And he throws about 100 solos into Loving You's a Dirty Job. Robin Crosby didn't have much input on Detonator, which only props up DeMartini's talents a bit more, meaning DeMartini can actually do better guitar work. Rat also attempts a power ballad on this album with Giving Yourself Away. Stephen Percy sounds pretty good, and this may be his best vocal performance. I don't know. I'm kind of mixed. So let's start out with the Out of the Cellar. It's good, not great, not a lot of deep cuts. I would say if there's any Rat album that like plays in my head, with songs that have really great hooks and riffs, and they're not round and round, it would be Out of the Cellar, and then Invasion of Your Privacy. And maybe that's a function of being a high school kid and listening to Rat all the time at the time, and playing it on the beach and spring break at night in Florida and stuff like that. All sorts of nostalgic associations. But I think about like She Wants Money, great song. you know that seems to be a deep cut to me. And we could come up with there isn't a bad song on the whole album. So I don't know, what do you guys think about that justification for putting Out of the Cellar way down at the bottom?
Yeah, I mean, for me, Rat's another one of those bands that the only Out of the Cellar is really the only album that sort of still has an impact. Like you were saying, Greg. If I
Okay.
think about Rat, I'm thinking about that time period and those songs, um, and the rest of it sort of just kind of like fades back into the woodwork, or sort of like the
The
wallpaper of,
other albums.
yeah, the other albums and stuff, right? And such that they just didn't really register for me. A bit like Quiet Riot that way. And then I was thinking too, like a bit like Motley Crue uh did for me, after, not that they after Dr. Feelgood for sure. Um just sort of is a wash for me. But that also makes me feel like I don't know that I really am sort of qualified to have much of an opinion on that, right? Because of that, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
it's sort of like me with Metallica after the Black album. I just kind of quit paying attention. And I
yeah,
know they've got some good stuff that came out after that, but I'm just not that,
yeah.
you know, I'm rather arbitrarily uninterested in hearing what they have to say when there's plenty of other great thrash bands I could be listening to, you know.
I would say the I would say Out of the Cellar is important
Mm,
because in my school we didn't have cable, so we didn't have MTV.
Mm.
yeah.
And so everybody was a deadhead. Everybody listened. Like if you went to a party, people listened to Crosby, Stills, and Nash and Young, and Simon and Garfunkel. I mean, we're talking high school during that time, which was weird because I was a metalhead, and I had to go hang out with kids in other towns, right?
Yeah.
I'll never forget when Out of the Cellar, when Round and Round came on the radio. I remember my friends, they had crossed out uh, a few of them Grateful Dead rules. They crossed it out on there. You remember how you covered your book with,
Yeah.
so they crossed it out and they wrote Round and Round. And then all of a sudden the Deadheads became, that song hit them so hard that I remember like looking around me going, oh, this is the album that's touching everybody. I did
Yeah.
like it. Um, and I will say, I mean, I don't think I wouldn't pick it as the best at all. I mean, I think it's important, but I think, yes, as it went on, like Reach for the Sky, at least on the recordings after, the bluesy thing is, um, uh, the sound was just cleaned up a lot, less
Yeah.
reverb,
Yeah. Right.
more tight, and I understand the argument for that, but I would choose Invasion of Your Privacy because the songs were amazing. And like one of my favorite moments on that album is You're in Love, where all of a sudden
Right. Right.
it hits that one chord and Warren DeMartini comes in with that one note. And that solo is there's not like a lot of notes in the solo, but it's like, oh wow. Like, and I used to like put the needle back just, and he's a very melodic player and his feel is amazing. But out of nowhere, they just go into this real, almost like a Dio type chord. It gets really dark all of a sudden, and then just this real melodic solo. Not only were the tunes great, there were some great moments that I had like hung on to, and that album stands the test of time for me. I mean, I saw
Yeah.
the I saw the Reach for the Sky tour. They sounded, I couldn't hear them. The sound was so bad. Even when Warren would start something like Lay It Down by himself, I couldn't tell what song it was.
Oh.
It was like whoever was the sound person was probably on something. Uh, but I remember being disappointed. I liked the album. I liked their other albums, but it didn't give me that, invasion of your privacy, the moments on that and the songs. I mean, everybody wanted to know the Lay It Down riff.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Even more than Round and Round because it was just, it, it was
Well,
certainly
I think that Invasion of Your Privacy is a heavier album.
yeah.
You look at I mean, in some ways, the stuff that's going on in guitar wise, and also in terms of like the singing, because there's two vocalists. You don't have Rat without both Warren DeMartini, that gritty, dirty sound, and then Juan Croce doing all of the high harmonies, sort of like Michael Anthony and Van Halen. You put those two albums side by side, and there's a lot of beautiful moments in Out of the Cellar. It's harder and heavier in Invasion of Your Privacy.
Yeah. That would be my pick anyway.
I would actually say Invasion of Your Privacy is I think it's the best album too. I mean, that said, there isn't a Rat album I don't like where I'm like, they were not what were they doing on this one or
Right.
something, right? So, more consistent performance, I think you could say across their corpus. And I'll actually say my favorite Rat song is not one on any of the albums. It's actually the one that they did as a one-off for Point Break, Nobody Rides for Free. It's such a great song and it's such great hooks and all of that. And they do play it in their, I should mention too. So when Rat goes and plays in concert, which now is no longer viable because they can't get along at all. Not round and round, Invasion of Your Privacy gets 2 songs usually in a set list. Out of the Cellar usually gets 4 or 5, and then every other album gets like at most 1. So it's clear what the band thinks the fans want to hear,
Right.
but that doesn't mean Invasion of Your Pride or that Out of the Cellar is actually the best album. But it is nice to see that they at least nod their head to Invasion of Your Privacy.
Yes. Yeah, definitely.
So we did actually have a few good observations, including from 2 people who often come to these sessions. Kenneth Blackwell said, my favorite album, Invasion of Your Privacy. Why? It took the fresh sounding proto glam rock of Out of the Cellar and further refined the songwriting, musical abilities of the band and improved the already surprisingly good production quality of the debut album. So a lot of different features there. Progarchy wrote Round and Round is the perfect song, but Infestation is their best album. Not only is every track of optimal quality, Rat shows they've lived and learned and implemented that wisdom in full on their final iteration. One other person wrote Invasion, easily they lost the plot after that.
Huh.
The album was them doing what they do best. They tried a little too hard to be relevant beyond glam. DeMartini is a formidable guitarist, but on Invasion, they were fully developed and unashamedly themselves, which is kind of an interesting observation. So the idea is they peaked at, yeah, I could kind of see that.
That's not too far from what I was saying, though, right?
Yeah.
Is there's that point in the mid '80s where they registered, where they really registered with me, and then it just kind of faded into the wallpaper.
Yeah.
But again, yeah,
I
I don't feel like I'm the greatest judge of Rat.
Part of what I always kind of liked about Rat, and Van Halen fits this as well. They are arguably glam metal bands, but they are always harder, heavier, grittier than like, the spectrum of bands that we count as glam, like Poison or Cinderella or stuff like that. So that's part of what hooked me in. Well, let's move on to our final one. And maybe Rob, you'll have more to say about these guys. Wasp, right? So now this is an interesting one in part because as opposed to say like Rat or Motley Crue or even Van Halen or Quiet Riot, there's one guy who runs the show in Wasp. It's Blackie Lawless. It's always been, even when it was in the earliest iteration of the band, he was the band leader. And so his views on things kind of dominate stuff, and he's the one who gives everybody direction. So the big contenders, the debut Wasp, Crimson Idol, Headless Children, their 4th album where they kind of changed direction a bit, and then The Last Command. Philly Rock says Crimson Idol is the best, followed by Wasp. Brave Words actually said the Headless Children, and then following that with Crimson Idol and Wasp. When he was asked in an interview, this is back in the early 2000s, Blackie Lawless says he was asked, which of Wasp's albums do you consider the best and most completed? So he said, the biggest selling record we ever had was Headless Children, but my favorite album is The Crimson Idol. That's my personal favorite. So that's an interesting contrast there. In social media, I did get some responses. One person said that's difficult to choose a great album of a great band. I have to go with their first album and first impressions. So I guess, that's the one that sticks with them. Another person said the debut, the energy level and attitude are insane. The songs are catchy as hell. There's enough shifts in tempo and feel throughout the album to keep it interesting. The production is nice and raw. The guitar tones have some real heft to them. Later albums, they have a more commercial, chorusy sheen to them. So they see a difference there. And then the other person said, I love the debut, but I think Crimson Idol, it's a very underrated album. So, we see things sorting out there, it seems like the favorites for most people, including Blackie Lawless himself, either the debut or Crimson Idol. I'll tell you which one I favor, but I want to hear from you guys first. Which one do you think is the best?
I'm gonna let Scott go first this time.
Okay.
Okay. I was later to the Wasp game, and they're probably who I'm least familiar with out of the list. But I remember my friend bringing over a bunch of Wasp albums. We used to like listen to albums, and I remember out of all of them he brought, I went and bought Crimson Idol, which
Okay.
I hadn't listened to in a while. I went back to re-listen to it, and I'm going to choose that as my favorite because it's like listening to it's like watching a movie. They take their time in the first song.
Mm-hmm.
Starts out quiet. They're not afraid to, they're not going for the 3-minute hit. They're not going for any cheap shots. It's just kind of, there's plenty of nice surprises in the writing. The guitar is fantastic. I looked up, it looks like Bob Kulick played on that one.
Yeah. Yeah.
And actually, one of my friends, Doug Blair, has been the guitarist for them for a while. I think he's not in the band anymore, but Doug Blair, I knew him pretty well. But in giving that a listen, of course, I had it on loud. It was just, it's an experience. Like I didn't want to. It's like a good book. I didn't want to stop it. Track after track, and the pace of the album is, it reminds me a little bit of like how Mindcrime. Queensryche's Mind Crime like progresses. Like you don't want to shut it off because you want to what's next in the movie. But like Crimson Idol, I think is a nice work of art. Actually, it's great. It's heavy. You get emotionally involved into, or I get emotionally involved in it. And now I remember why that's the one I picked when my friend brought over a few of the albums. I was like, well, this is. I went out the next day and got it. And but that's the one I definitely picked. That's all the stuff is great, but that's just like a serious work. I love it.
Yeah, it's interesting because so we talked a little bit about band lineup changes like wreaking havoc, right? Particularly with Quiet Riot. I think in a band like Wasp, Blackie Lawless is enough of a dominating figure that he, no matter what it is, it's going to be a Blackie Lawless production. And, there's some great
Right.
people who played with him. Randy Piper, Chris Holmes in the early years, and then picking it up again for a few things in the late 90s. I mean, it looks like on bass, once Blackie quit playing bass, he's got a pretty consistent thing, but drummers are all over the place. I mean, it's one of those bands where in a way the drummer kind of doesn't matter that much because it's Blackie's conception of what's going on. So you get more consistent quality going from album to album, even though you're changing the component people in it, right?
Wasp to me is Blackie Lawless.
Yeah.
Like all the time, it was synonymous. I mean, he had the cool look. He was just like, the good thing is like King Diamond in the way that they invite you into their world, right? It's kind of like a fantasy world. And I do like that aspect of it. I do think part of the image in the world you create, whether it's Iron Maiden with Eddie and their, but yeah, I consider Blackie Lawless to be underrated in the metal world. People don't talk about him as much. And when I listened to that album again, I was like, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah,
What
I
do you
would,
think, Ron?
I would agree. I think one of the things about Wasp in general is, I mean, I think that's right. What you guys have been saying about Blackie's dominance over the whole thing, which makes for a much more unified catalog in a way, right? And much more consistent. So unlike some of the other bands we've talked about, I don't think they have the huge dips and peaks in, this album's kind of awful and nobody knows what the hell it is. It's always Wasp, right? And that's, of the other bands we've talked about, the only other one that's really like that is the Van Halen stuff, right?
Right. Yeah.
but I would agree that the Crimson Idol and the first one are, the first one sets the stage, and the Crimson Idol feels like a peak, right? So I have a tough time picking, but yeah, I mean, that's what I'd say. Yeah.
Okay.
It's also,
So go
I'll
ahead.
also say that Crimson Idol, I've noticed it was their third album,
No, they're fifth.
Yeah.
their fifth album. Okay, that makes
Yeah.
more sense. I'm just looking at the lineup here and I'm thinking
Yeah.
for a third album to get that, you know, get have an album done so well. The first one is amazing. Like if you listen to the stuff, it's just all amazing. But like
Yeah.
that was like for me, that was like years of working stuff out and coming out with a masterpiece, I think.
Yeah.
So
So I'm gonna go and take a different direction.
Ooh.
I want to say their best album is actually The Headless Children.
okay.
And some of it is based on, so I was a huge Wasp fan as soon as I got exposed to them as a kid. And I had all the stuff up to that. And then Headless Children came out, interestingly, just as I was going into the army, and I had it on cassette, and I would just listen to it over and over and over again over in the barracks. And it was a departure in terms of like production, the thematics, it was much more political the way it was oriented. I don't know, there's something about it that I think it stands up today. It's great songs. And one of the things I really appreciated about it is, we've talked about this before in the past, in terms of cover songs. There are some heavy metal cover songs where the cover is clearly superior to the original. Like you take like Judas Priest, Diamonds and Rust is kind of an outlier because it's too different, right?
Right.
But Better by You, Better Than Me, way better. Green Manalishi with the two-prong crown. I mean, if you've ever listened to the Fleetwood Mac version, it's just garbage. Judas Priest turned that into an amazing song. The Real Me, I want to say Wasp's version of that, and I know this will be very controversial, is better than the Who's version of it. I like it better. And to pull that off, that's tough to do. They also had a cover on the like extended edition of Locomotive Breath that is also just amazing,
They did a cover of
So yeah.
Oh
And
wow.
so I think Crimson Idol follows right after that. Crimson Idol is amazing, right? The debut is amazing, but I think Headless Children is the best album.
All right.
And I'll fight you about it. No, I mean it's interesting because as opposed to like we were talking about Quiet Riot, peaking early, kind of going down. So you got the debut album for Wasp, really good, makes a huge impact. They follow it up with two really good albums that are more radio friendly. Restless Gypsy and I'm Blind in Texas and stuff like that on The Last Command and Inside the Electric Circus. But then, Headless Children comes out and Crimson Idol after that. And I think that's like maybe the apex of their performances,
Mhm. Yeah.
So before we end, we started out with a really big picture thing. Can we actually come up with criteria that are meaningful, that might convince other people about best albums? We've done some, test cases. What do you think? Is it still just, I mean, Rob, you were saying earlier, I don't think that anybody can come up with a best album for a band, but you're not saying it's totally subjective, right? We
No,
are,
no,
yeah,
no. It's not mere subjectivity. It's just that there are criteria we can talk about that sometimes come in conflict, right? I mean,
yeah,
and we've run across several of those in our discussion, right? This one's really important, but I like this one better. Are different questions, right? And the problem
right.
is best, when you say best, it's completely underdetermined what question you're actually asking, right? We could be asking about most unified, which one has the best songs, which one brings back the best nostalgic memories or whatever, right? These are all
Yeah.
different questions that can get subsumed under best. And I was thinking about the guitarist list example that Scott brought up. Who are the best guitarists? I don't know what question they're asking, really, right? I mean, so
Yeah.
this is
Yeah.
a philosopher in me, right? Can I imagine some questions where you could come up with some of the people on that list? Sure. Do they tell us what they're asking? No. Can I imagine a whole bunch of questions about the best guitarist that would leave none of those people on that list? Also, yes. Right. So I think
Yeah.
the disambiguating what question we're really asking is what's required to really get an answer.
Let
So,
me actually give you a follow-up on that.
sure.
So best guitarist lists, right? Now we're
Yeah.
comparing like a body of work and probably some other factors as well. An album it's got a guitarist, at least one usually. I mean, if it's a metal album, probably two guitarists in a lot of cases, or a guitarist and a keyboardist, but you've got other people in the mix as well. Are there more questions, or is it a more complicated set to ask about best album than best guitarist?
I would think so. And because one of the things that you don't necessarily have with guitarists, at least not with every guitarist, is you could ask questions about, like, on an album, how well
Yeah,
does a particular album show how well the various members are, you know, at how well they're implementing a vision, right? Or something like
right,
that.
right.
Whereas for a guitarist, I suppose you could ask that about how well do they work with the vision of whatever particular ensemble they might be working with at a time. But that might not be a question that's terribly central to whether they're a great guitarist or not.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, or not as central as it would be for
It might
evaluating an
also
album.
depend too, like how much autonomy does that guitarist have? So like
Yeah.
Eddie Van Halen gets to do what he wants. If you're if you're in some band and you get hired as the rhythm guitarist, you're playing what they tell you to play, right?
Yeah.
You'll have some input, but not as much as if you're the sole lead guitarist. Or if you're Tony Iommi, I mean, you are the band leader.
Yeah.
You decide what's going on. As opposed to like so in Wasp, right? Chris Holmes, Randy Piper, both of them guitarists there, but Blackie Lawless got to tell them what they were doing, you
Mhm.
know.
Or another example I think of, and this is leaving the metal world, is Stevie Ray Vaughan, right? When he recorded on
Right.
David Bowie's Let's Dance album, right? You can hear that it's Stevie Ray, uh, but he was being told what to do, right?
Or Eddie Van Halen playing for Michael Jackson.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
He actually changed the song. He put the progression in there because he wanted to play over moving chords. I think that you can maybe ask the question, what is this guitarist's best performance on what album?
Yeah.
But
Mm.
but you can't ask, I mean, people will always ask me that question, who's the best? What kind of question is that?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
what and you know, this may seem like a cop out, but I honestly say, what do you think they are? They're the best them in the universe. I mean, what are you saying? Like how fast they play, how many albums they've done? Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
there's no way to say because they're not in it to compete. I mean, ideally, you're in it to find your own voice, right, and your own uniqueness. And I always say it's easy to copy what somebody else did because it's already been time tested. So
Yeah. Yeah.
if you copy Clapton, all the Cream stuff, and you can play that note for note, you're going to be accepted because it's already been done. And so I always think that's the weirdest thing. But you can ask, okay, uh, Eric Johnson, what's the best album? What's your favorite playing of his?
Yeah.
That's a little more that then you can make a case for it.
Okay.
Or more of a case for it than who. When people ask me who's better, neither of them. They're both awesome. What do you want me to say?
I mean, it's interesting too that you you could have a guitarist or a bassist or, even a singer. And if they're in the wrong ensemble and they're stuck in it, they're never going to be able to produce the stuff that would have been truly great, you know? I mean, so, Warren DeMartini and Rat, he found a home and it allowed him to express himself really well and all of that. Imagine if Warren DeMartini had been stuck in Quiet Riot in place of Carlos Cavazo. He might not have been able to get along with all these guys, and maybe his playing, maybe we'd never even think about him.
Well, then there's the thing, like, oh, well, this guy's the best bass player. Yeah, but nobody can play an Iron Maiden except for Steve Harris. Steve Harris is,
Yeah.
you could bring Geddy Lee in and it's not going to be Maiden anymore. Geddy Lee's a great bass player, but he's perfect for Rush, right?
I wonder. So we saw the Iron Maidens, this all-female tribute band 2 years ago. And I was really curious to see how is this going to work? Because actually, before them, it was a Guns N' Roses all-female tribute band, and I forget what their name was. And we were like, Guns N' Roses, good band, not a great band. It'll be interesting to see who's subbing in for Slash and how she's doing. That's probably the most interesting thing. The
Yeah.
singer, of course, like had the sinuous old school dancing stuff down. That was kind of cool to see. And it is a kind of a weird sound sonically to old Axl Rose's singing, on the classic stuff. But so we were going to see the Iron Maidens, and I was like, okay, is the singer going to be able to pull off Bruce Dickinson? And she did, and that's a huge vocal performance. And then I was like, what's the bassist going to be like? Can she actually like do all of these things and have the kind of stage presence that Steve Harris does? She pulled it off. I think, I don't know that she'd be doing anything like adventurous, but I bet that you could sub her in. And I think she was also with Phantom Blue for a while. So she's been around
Yes.
for a while. Yeah. I think she could be, let's say Steve Harris suddenly got sick and he's like, and he got arthritis in his fingers. And he's like, I can't play bass anymore. What's going to happen to Iron Maiden? And they call her up. I think she could probably tour with them and play the catalog. Now, of course, it's not Steve Harris because it's obviously a different person. But you wouldn't be like, oh, this sucked. I was waiting to hear this great stuff, and she couldn't pull it off.
Although you'd have to find a Steve Harris clone. That's why we use her, because she's modeled her playing
Exactly.
Harris,
Yeah.
which already exists, So you'd have to, again, it's still Steve Harris. It's just somebody copying Steve Harris.
I mean, to be Geddy Lee might make it actually harder to play like Steve Harris, right? Because there's so much of Geddy Lee's own individuality wrapped up in it.
Yeah, and his concept is different in Rush. I mean, these are bands that developed over decades, and
Yeah.
they came up with their sound and the way they played. I'd actually feel cheated. Like if I saw Geddy Lee play with Maiden, I would rather him sound like Geddy Lee, and rather than him trying to sound like Steve Harris.
Yeah.
It's like we should hear what this band sounds like with another personality, because there's one Steve Harris, and there's copies, but there's still one Steve Harris. I definitely think, yeah, you like a lot of times they'll get like Tommy Thayer. I think he was in a Kiss tribute band.
Oh, right. Yeah.
So the Ace thing, he was practicing the Ace thing with the songs for years. So
Yeah, and sometimes these replacement players will originally be the techs for
that's it.
the person they replace as well. Yeah.
I think he was both, because
That rings a bell. Yeah.
I think he was a tech, but he also had a Kiss tribute band.
Yeah.
And I heard he had to suit up one night when Ace didn't show up.
I think I've heard that too. And that's not a surprise given Ace's track record of using substances, we'll say, right?
His predilections.
Yes.
Yeah, there you go. Well, we're getting close to the top of our second hour, so I think we should probably wrap it up. Thanks, Rob, for joining us
Yeah, Rob.
impromptu on this. It was a lot of fun, and we're looking forward to interviewing you a bit more formally next time about that philosophy and heavy metal class.
Yeah, sounds
Yeah.
great. Thanks for inviting me in.
Oh man, it was such a pleasure having you, Rob. Really.
Thanks, Scott.
Yeah, I look forward to talking to you more.
All right.
It'll be good.